This face has not been seen since before the birth of Christ. A deep wound slices down from the forehead, through the eye, and into the cheek. Reconstruction of the face began with this ancient skull. Medical artist Richard Neve used forensic techniques for identifying modern-day murder victims from fragments of their skulls. This skull comes from an ancient burial site in northern Greece. A tomb on the site contained a 2,000-year-old skull and a skeleton archaeologists believed was that of Philip of Macedon, one of the ancient world's greatest commanders. The main clue was a nick in the bone over the right eye.
We know that Philip II was wounded in the right eye by an arrow. Here we can see the relationship of the damage to the upper border of the eye socket here and the cheekbone here. And one can think of a barbed arrow coming down from above. It's going to come crashing down here, damage the bone, tear across the eyeball, and then fracture the cheekbone here. Quite clearly, with an injury like that, that man is going to be blind in that eye. So that is the first sort of important thing that one can see when you reassemble all these pieces of the bone.
The evidence fits a description of Philip losing an eye to a stray arrow during a siege. The account says, Philip accepted the loss of an eye in exchange for domination and power. Philip's quest for power began in Macedonia, a wild barbarian kingdom north of the Greek city-states. Over 20 years, Philip developed a new type of army. He understood the power of the Greek pike square, or phalanx, and placed it at the heart of his own army. Philip was one of the shrewdest military organizers in history. He didn't just borrow the phalanx, he took it one step further. To do so, he looked to the rolling hills of Macedonia. The nobles of the north were exceptional horsemen. Philip took these men and turned them into cavalry. From the island of Crete, he recruited fierce tribesmen, famous for their expertise as archers. He added specialist warriors whose skill with javelin and sling could disrupt enemy formations as they assembled for battle. Putting these units together, Philip created an army that was far more flexible than any of the Greek city-states had mustered. But above all, Philip increased the deadliness of the phalanx. The balance between arms and armor was tipped heavily toward arms. Philip reduced the size of shields. He lengthened the spear, or sarissa, from 8 feet to 14. With its spears lowered for battle, the lethal points of the first 5 ranks extended beyond the front of the phalanx. In battle, an enemy soldier would find 10 spearheads coming at him. Once it was moving, with rank upon rank of pikemen pressing each other forward, the phalanx developed an unstoppable momentum. Anything that got in its way faced wall after wall of sharp, thrusting iron. The Macedonian phalanx skewered its enemy like pieces of meat. The hardest part of battle was to keep its spearheads free of enemy dead. Philip revolutionized warfare not only because of the way he taught his troops to fight, he also paid them and trained them all year round. Unlike their Greek neighbors, Philip's army campaigned in all seasons. They could march 20 to 30 miles a day with their heavy equipment. No other army could match them. This was a professional army, a permanent standing army. Philip's army was unstoppable. In 20 years of campaigning, he defeated the tribes of Thessaly and Thrace, conquered much of the Balkans, northern Greece, and the European parts of modern Turkey. But the great prize lay to the south. Philip wanted the rich old city-states of Greece. He marched south through the pass of Thermopylae. On the flat plain of Chaeronea, in the heart of Greece, a hoplite army stood in his way. Philip's new army was to meet the best of the old. Fighting at Philip's side was a promising young commander, his son Alexander. (338 BC), the Battle of Chaeronea. Across this plain, 50,000 Athenians and Thebans faced Philip's Macedonian army of 32,000. The fate of all Greece hung on the outcome. On the left flank, Philip's son Alexander commanded the cavalry. Only 18 years old, Alexander had his eye on his father's throne. The Thebans advanced, led by their elite force, the Sacred Band, a unit of 300 homosexual lovers sworn to fight to the death. Philip ordered his phalanx to roll forward. Then he feigned a retreat. He lured the Athenians forward until a gap opened between them and the Thebans. Alexander gave the order. A single headlong cavalry charge broke the enemy line. With 6,000 dead, the Athenians turned and ran for their lives. The Thebans lost 20,000. The Sacred Band was destroyed to a man. True to their word, the Sacred Band had fought side by side to the death. Philip so admired their courage that he approved a monument to commemorate their sacrifice. With victory at Chaeronea, Philip was ruler of Greece, but just 2 years later he was dead, assassinated. Alexander inherited the throne of Greece, and with it his father's most ambitious dream, to destroy Persia. With his new Macedonian army, he had the means to achieve it. At the heart of Alexander's army was the companion cavalry. Its officers lived together as brothers, sharing risks and competing against each other in courage and military daring. Courage was something Alexander possessed in abundance. He led from the front. In his merciless treatment of the Thebans, Philip's son Alexander showed what would become his hallmark: total annihilation of the enemy.
He was a ruthless person who would kill his close friends if the mood took him. He was also very contemptuous of his own safety if he felt it necessary to risk his life. 9 times wounded, once, the last time, almost to death. He was not a person to go drinking with on a Saturday night, literally, because of course it was all at a drinking session that he did kill one of his closest friends, Cleistus, by thrusting a spear through his chest because Cleistus had said something he didn't like.
Over 3 years, from 334 to 331 BC, Alexander beat the Persian army at Granicus, Issus, and finally at Arbela in modern Iraq. Alexander, master of Greece, was now ruler of Asia Minor, Egypt, and Syria. Ahead of him lay an epic campaign of conquest which would take him to Afghanistan and India, far beyond the boundaries of the known world. To this day, no other warlord has conquered an area larger than the empire of Alexander in so short a time. And throughout his reign, the core of Alexander's army came from his homeland of Macedonia. No one had ever tackled the problem of feeding and supplying an army so far from home. Alexander's genius was to be both a great fighter and the father of modern logistics. He kept his army close to the coast, supplying them from a flotilla of ships that followed the army's advance. Once supplied, Alexander's men had to carry their own provisions. If Alexander caught them using ox carts to carry food or equipment, he would burn the cart and slaughter the ox. An ox could only pull enough supplies to feed itself for 8 days, let alone carry food for his army.
In Alexander's time, he was driven to a certain extent by the availability of logistic support, whether water, whether grain, whether forage, whatever it was, in the direction which he went. Now, to take an example, there was some question as to which route he was going to take. Would he go down the Euphrates Valley, or would he go along the north? And for logistic reasons, he went across the top and then down the eastern side of the Tigris River. The reason was that the grass was growing along the northern side where it was a bit higher and a bit cooler, and therefore grass didn't burn off. And also the grain there was in undefended villages which he could get, rather than the Euphrates Valley where there was no grass because it burnt off during the summer, and all the grain was in defended locations. That is, I think, an example where logistic considerations drove an operational decision.
When forced away from the coast and his supply dumps, Alexander followed rivers for fresh water. He often sent messengers ahead with bribes and promises of clemency for those who would provision his troops. As he marched his troops farther from home than any army before, logistics and supply became a matter of life and death. The arithmetic is simple. If 100,000 men run out of food, 100,000 die. Nowhere is managing supplies more crucial than during a siege. A besieging army is static. Local food sources soon run out. Termissos in Asia Minor sits high on a mountain peak. The only approach is through narrow passes that are easily defended. Alexander came upon the city during his journey through Anatolia. He didn't like what he saw. The city was isolated. Alexander knew its supplies would eventually run out. But at high altitude and in difficult terrain, so would his. The gain would not match the investment. Wisely, he withdrew. 10 years after he abandoned the siege at Termissos, Alexander's empire covered virtually all the known world. A lesser commander might have lost everything at the very start in a hopeless assault on Termissos. Alexander was one of the boldest generals in history and one of the shrewdest. In the entire history of warfare, no man has matched the achievements of Alexander the Great. For more than 2,000 years, his legend has obsessed the greatest generals. Julius Caesar wept because he couldn't match Alexander's conquests. Napoleon thought you couldn't understand war without studying Alexander. Even Adolf Hitler professed his admiration for the king of Macedonia. At 33, Alexander was dead, and his name passed into legend. In his short, brilliant life, Alexander took his army further east than any European army would travel until the age of gunpowder.